I'm very sorry about how Lecture 6 ended so abruptly. I was trying to move it to show you a map, and I touched the glass on my iPhone, and whoop, it stopped. But anyway, Lecture 7, Western Civ 2, Lecture 7, will complete the Korean War. And we had gotten up to November 25th, 1950. The armies of the United States and our South Korean allies are pushing the North Korean army back through North Korea. By late November, by Thanksgiving Day, 1950, American troops at one point can actually see the Yalu River, Y-A-L-U, Yalu River, which separates North Korea from communist China. They could see the river. They could see China. At one place, they had gotten all the way to the northern edge of North Korea. And in a bunch of the rest, they were only 100 miles away. This mountainous terrain, but the North Korean army was in an utter rout. It was totally collapsing. And it looked like, at Thanksgiving of 1950, Douglas MacArthur's plan to reunite Korea under an American-friendly government was going to work. It looked like it. And then everything changed. It turned out that communist Chinese troops, by the hundreds of thousands, had been infiltrating into North Korea. They were hiding in the mountains of North Korea, waiting on American and South Korean troops to get there. The North Koreans were falling back in chaos, but then in late November 1950, the communist Chinese troops pounced on the American army. Douglas MacArthur was caught completely by surprise. Nobody had any clue. But hundreds of thousands of People's Liberation Army troops from China had infiltrated, and they hit the American forces like a ton of bricks. And the Americans started tumbling back in chaos. The Marines I'm drawing a blank on the name of the reservoir. I can't think of it. There's one place, a lake in North Korea, where they held the line and suffered mightily for it. But most of the American troops, the United States Army troops, panicked and fled in terror before the North Korean human wave assaults. And it became known as the Great Bug Out. The Great Bug Out. A bug out is a slang military term for a chaotic, disorganized retreat where you're running for your life, usually after throwing your weapon down. And that's exactly what happened to the U.S. Army and even elements of the Marine Corps, which don't like to say they ever retreat. They had to fall back very quickly. And the result of this was, in about a month, American forces were back nearly to the 38th parallel, the place where the North and South Korean division had happened. Now, so here we are, 6 months into the war. Communist China and the United States are now killing each other on the battlefield in horrific battles with massive casualties. So this small fight between North and South Korea has become a fight between a major communist power and the United States. Remember, when I say the Cold War lacked hot wars between the United States and the Soviets, it doesn't mean there weren't terrible wars going on during that long 45-year period. There were, but they were what are called proxy wars. The communist Chinese sort of stood in for the Soviets, but they had a huge army and a lot of zeal for their cause. So they fought terribly hard and took enormous casualties, as the Americans did. Well, Douglas MacArthur was shocked by this communist Chinese attack. He hates communists. And his initial response is, we need to attack them with atomic weapons. Douglas MacArthur started threatening in the newspaper to attack China with atomic weapons. And a fair number of Americans back home were saying, yeah, we got those atomic weapons, let's use them. But Truman was horrified. The Chinese communists at this point are still allies of the Soviet Union, as are the North Koreans. If we attack them with atomic weapons, it's very possible the Soviets will attack us with atomic weapons. By 1950, into 1950, that was no idle threat. The Soviets have the bomb. They have made plenty of them. It's very possible American cities could be incinerated in an atomic war. So he naturally felt that MacArthur was way out of line to be talking to the news media about this. And that's part of it. He wasn't going through channels in the Pentagon to the White House or something. He wasn't calling up the president on the phone, which he could have done, and asking if this is a possibility. He was suggesting it to the American news media, and it was being run in the newspapers back home, on the radio back home. And Truman ordered him to stop. But remember, MacArthur is that prima donna. He loves the attention. He loves the accolades and the praise. And he, frankly, didn't respect the President of the United States like he should. So he kept popping his mouth off. Eventually, Truman actually flew to an island in the South Pacific to meet MacArthur in person. And he gave him the Distinguished Service Cross for the Inchon operation, a medal. And a few days later, after they met, apparently he told him, "You will pipe down," and he didn't. Well, Truman fired Douglas MacArthur. He fired this war hero from World War II, the man who'd come up with the Inchon plan and almost had victory in Korea in our grasp, gets fired by the president. There was a firestorm in the press. The newspapermen loved this showman MacArthur. Who is this little guy from Missouri who just accidentally became our president to go around firing a war hero? And that caused quite a firestorm politically for a while. But in the end, most Americans came to say he's the commander-in-chief. President Truman is the commander-in-chief. He's in charge of this. And we have to abide by his decisions. So MacArthur retired. He came home and gave a very moving address to the joint session of Congress. Clap, clap, clap. Very moving. But in the end, it all blew over. The commander who was placed in charge, Matthew Ridgway, was a soldier's soldier. He was not a showman. He never talked to the press if he could possibly avoid it. But he did stiffen the spine of his troops. The bug out stopped. He would go to the front, pistol in hand, shooting at the enemy, taking unnecessary risks, frankly. But it showed that the general wasn't scared of them. He would stand and fight them, and the men finally rallied. And Ridgway stopped the bug out, ended the Chinese communist advance, and by the middle of 1951, things had stabilized very near the 38th parallel, very near the original division between North and South Korea before all this war started. Matthew Ridgway deserves enormous credit for what he did in Korea. Unfortunately, he was not commander long because he was killed in a Jeep accident. His vehicle rolled off a cliff and he was killed. But he does deserve credit for stabilizing the situation. Unfortunately, Korea then became a stalemate. For nearly 2 years, the armies slugged it out in horrible battles. The Chinese and the North Koreans would send hundreds of thousands of troops in enormous assaults. The American army would be pushed a little back, but then they'd fight their way back. Thousands of men died over a hilltop of no importance. 2 years of this bloody death and misery in Korea, but virtually nothing on the ground changed. It was a lot like the trenches of World War I in Western Europe, the Western Front. Remember when we talked about that? Same kind of thing happened in Korea. Very cold winters there, and the troops suffered awfully in these conditions. Casualties on both sides were horrifically high, but nothing changed. Meanwhile, finally, the North Koreans and the Chinese, mainly the Chinese, everybody knew the Chinese were now calling the shots. They were most of the troops fighting in the northern side. Agreed to enter peace talks at a place called Panmunjom, a little village right along the 38th parallel. But the Chinese communists were not really interested in ending this war. They thought their prestige was being enhanced by showing the world they could fight the United States to a stalemate. So they took every opportunity to blow the peace talks off, frankly. The first session, they show up for peace talks, and the Chinese side says, "We won't sit down and talk to you. Our flags on the table are not the same size." quite literally, the American and Chinese flags were not identically the same size. The Chinese flag was a little smaller. So no peace talks. You've got to treat us with absolute equal respect. And they walked away, I think, for a full month over that, because they weren't really interested in ending the war. But finally, in the end, what ended the logjam was the election of 1952 in the United States. Harry Truman chose not to run. The Republicans nominated General Dwight Eisenhower, the man who had commanded D-Day, the man who had led the British and American assault on the Nazi Germany in Europe, the man who had freed Western Europe, right? The biggest war hero we had in World War II. A professional general was elected president in 1952. And the Chinese communists were afraid this might change the equation on the ground in the war in Korea. And they also thought maybe they could ingratiate themselves a bit. And the Soviets, too, were putting pressure on the Chinese to bring this to an end because they wanted to get the measure of Eisenhower. So the war continued in the first few months of Eisenhower's administration, but the talks finally progressed once he was elected, and the war came to an end in 1953. I said the war came to an end. That's not technically right. The war is technically still going on. In fact, it wasn't technically a war at all. It was a police action. This was the first time that huge numbers of American forces had ever been sent into combat in what was truly a war on the ground and in the air, but was never declared by Congress. Instead, United States forces were sent in conformity with a UN resolution. The UN Security Council passed a resolution because the Soviets were not there to veto it. The Soviets had been absent for a couple of months protesting something the UN was doing, and the United States was able to force through a resolution through the UN Security Council, and the UN technically was the one defending South Korea, and American troops there technically were UN troops, and the American commander on the ground there technically was a UN commander. So we never actually declared war on North Korea or the Chinese. So there was no peace treaty worked out. There was what's called an armistice, right? You know, that's a long-term ceasefire so you can work out a treaty of some kind. Well, here we sit 67 years later, and there still has been no treaty to end the Korean War. We are still technically in an armistice. And the 38th parallel area right around it, that is the stable line they settled at the end in 1953, is heavily armed. It's called the Dmz, Demilitarized Zone. There's a strip of land a few miles wide that no side can have any military forces in, the Demilitarized Zone. But on each side of that are huge barbed wire fences and minefields and lots of soldiers, including 50,000 American soldiers on the southern side. There is a tripwire. If fighting starts again, if the North invades South Korea again, the United States will be involved from the first second of the shooting. So they hopefully won't be able to overrun all of South Korea like they nearly did in 1950. But that tension along the North Korea-South Korea border is still part of what's been going on in the modern age. You know, North Korea has atomic weapons now and long-range rockets. And so you probably in your lifetime heard about worries about the nuclear threat from North Korea and their missile threat. President Trump has been involved in talks on and off with the North Korean leadership for most of his presidency about this. Nothing settled. There you go. 1953 would see the end of the Korean War with this stalemate, armistice, armed peace along the border there. Next time we'll talk about America in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the economic prosperity that came, and the Red Scare. So this ends Lecture 7 for Western Civ. Bye.